The next thing, I graduated from high school, and I went in the Army right away. And then John always likes to hear the stories about P Rolt. Now, P Rolt, now you have to understand, this was before I was a church member. P Rolt was he was funny, but he was a real stinker. He drank a lot. He drank quart jars, or imperial quarts that you buy in Europe, of orange-flavored vodka. And he was a tanker. And P Rolt was, it was comical, the things he did. But when you think about it, it wasn't comical at all. The commanders always told us when we go out in these war games, you're out there for 25, 35, sometimes 40 to 60 days, living in a pup tent, sleeping in a sleeping bag in the middle of winter. And it's colder than a well digger's wazoo out there. So you gotta watch what you're doing. And they always, the guys would sneak into the grocery stores or into the guest house or the bars, and drink too much and cause trouble. So the commanders always told everybody, if you get caught going into a guest house or a grocery store, it's going to be disciplinary action big time. So P Rolt, he was a tank commander. At that time, they had M48 tanks, which is just an old tank. And he, those wooden rulers that unfold, they have about this long, and they unfold that length, and they're about 6 or 8 foot long. He had 2 of those in his tank. He would just traverse the gun over to the guest house window and unfold that thing and shove a note and the money up the tube, and they'd shove the bottles and the bread and the bolognas and all that stuff right down the gun tube, and he's down there catching it. He didn't even have to go in there. And the next thing, he was trolley all over the place. And I was driving along behind him in a Jeep one time, and we came through this little village, and there was a house with a kind of a pretty picket fence, quite a lengthy picket fence. And he just decided he didn't like that picket fence, so he just kind of shoved that tank over a little bit, and he just mowed that picket fence down flatter than a dime. Well, I spoke German, still do pretty well. So they used me for the maneuver damage claims interpreter to go out with the claims officer. And that guy replaced that picket fence with a nice stone wall. But P Rolt mowed it down. And another thing he did, the same thing once behind a Volkswagen. And this is where I decided P Rolt was a mean, rotten stinker. He was drunker than a skunk in that tank. And he'd kick the driver out, and he'd get up there and drive the tank. And he just scooped over there and kind of veered over to the right, and he squashed a Volkswagen just flatter than a dime one time, intentionally. And it was that old kind of Volkswagen Bug where it had an oval-shaped round window, and you couldn't see whether there was somebody in that. He had no way of knowing if there was anybody in that Volkswagen. He just decided he's going to squash that Volkswagen, and boy, he did. There was nothing like it. The whole thing wasn't that thick when he got done. A little while later, we had a field maneuver out in the boondocks, and he went through a village, and again, of course, he's 3 sheets in the wind, and he came around a corner, and it was kind of a steep grade there in this little village, and the cobblestone streets, and it was pretty slick. Well, he turned a corner and decided he wasn't going to go down that steep grade. He's going to find a different way to go. But he had already gone down just a little bit, and the tank just started sliding. It slid all the way down there, down at the bottom of the hill, and the gun tube's pointing straight ahead. And it came up against the curb down at the bottom, and the tank's rocking back and forth, and that gun tube's ticking on a great big, huge plate glass, and tick, tick, tick. And it was a Männer- und Herren Friseur, what do you call it? Men and women's barber / beauty shop kind of thing. And it kept ticking, that thing, and it finally came to a stop. And all of a sudden that whole window turned into a million cracks and just fell out into the street like water. And he had to buy that. But the worst thing he did, he'd go, one time he came to a farm, and there was a large stack of hay bales. and he decided he's gonna hide that tank and take the week off. So he talked to the farmer, and he moved that stack of hay bales over to where his tank was, right next to him, and he buried the tank in those hay bales. And they went inside the guest house and got to a couple of rooms, and they spent the week in there just drunker than lords. Well, he comes out of there, after 3 or 4 days, and he takes off in his tank, 3 sheets in the wind, and goes off into another village, driving through the village, and somehow he had some kind of trouble and drove the tank into a guest house. And the commander's hatch on the top of the tank was right underneath the chandelier. The driver's hatch was right up against the bar, and the gun was sticking across the bar through the little window into the kitchen in the back. And they'd been calling him for, 3 or 4 days to find out where he's at, because we were getting ready to go back to where we were stationed, which is a 100-mile convoy back. And they called and called and called, and his name, I'll never forget his call sign, Persona 544. And they called him and called him and called him. Finally, one day he answers. "This is Foo," he said. And the commander says, "Where in the heck are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm in this guest house." And he said, "You get yourself right out of that guest house and get on your tank." And he said, "Yeah, I am on my tank." And it was, too. It was inside there. That cost him a fortune. Those guys they each had to pay, $5,000 or $6,000 over that. Well, that's the P Rolt story.